Edit.
A lot of times when composers or producers are putting together multiple lines in a piece of music, they have issues with whether something seems to go together. Part of the going together has to do with whether you're controlling for all of the voices going on in a composition, your bass line, your melody, your other accompanying parts, is all following the same harmonic progression. So that's part of it. Are we all in the same key? Are we all changing chords at the same time as the other voices are in the composition? But at a more fine-tuned angle, we're also trying to strive for this notion of line independence. Does the bass line and the melody and any other counter melody that you have in the mix they're not stepping on each other's toes? Are they in respective ranges? Are they all doing different notes of a harmony to make it sound like a full harmony and sound like each one of these lines are distinctly melodic in their own right? So to help guide us in that act of controlling for voice independence and multiple relationships between different lines in a composition, I want to turn our attention to the study of counterpoint. And we're going to look at this from a Johann Joseph Fuchs standpoint, species counterpoint, which is basically studying the old 16th century compositions of Giovanni Luigi Palestrina and things like this. Why go back this far? Because a lot of the principles, even though we're talking about a species counterpoint, which is a very strict, controlled, rules-based level of composition, many of the rules that we applied to these early species helps us on counterpoint rewriting of any style, even of contemporary nature. So let's go back and learn what these 5 species are in this next series of videos. We'll go one species at a time. And hopefully the rules that are applying to this early study of species counterpoint can help us in our own melodic writing. In counterpoint, multiple musical lines, or voices as we know, are woven together to create harmonies. Each line must stand on its own as a melody while fitting into the larger structure of the piece. To learn counterpoint, we use 5 stages called species. Each species focuses on a different aspect of melody, rhythm, and interaction between voices, progressing from simple note against note relationships to more complex rhythmic and melodic combinations. Traditionally, counterpoint is learned by creating new lines around a provided cantus firmus, which is a pre-existing melody often derived from Gregorian chant or sacred melodies. It's usually a stepwise, slow-moving melody without complex rhythms. Each of the 5 species will have clearly defined rules around the rhythmic values and embellishing tones that we can use when creating a second voice to this cantus firmus line. If the cantus firmus is written only in whole notes, for instance, we'll use whole notes and no dissonances between the voices in first species. We'll use half notes and dissonant passing or neighboring tones in second species. We'll use quarter notes and dissonant passing and neighboring tones in third species. We'll feature half notes tied over a bar line with dissonant suspensions introduced in fourth species, and then a free combination of all the previous possibilities in fifth species. In this first video, we're going to focus on first species, or note against note counterpoint. The goal in first species counterpoint is to create consonances, perfect intervals like octaves and fifths, and imperfect consonant ones like thirds and sixths at all times between the 2 voices. Sometimes the cantus firmus will be present in the upper voice, sometimes we'll have it appearing in the lower. Here I have an example of each, and we'll see what opportunities and challenges are presented with each scenario. Here's the cantus firmus in the upper example. It sounds like this. So our goal when writing first species counterpoint is to balance good melodic writing with careful control of our vertical intervals between the 2 voices. Here are a few ground rules to guide our melodies. Since this is note against note counterpoint, we're only using whole notes for the rhythm because our cantus firmus in this top example consists only of whole notes. This is the traditional way, but really this principle applies no matter what note value we use. So you'll see I'm using quarter notes in the bottom one. We should begin the counterpoint a fifth or an octave above the cantus firmus and make sure that we never cross voices with it. Our melody should move primarily stepwise, featuring a single melodic climax or high point. Whenever we introduce a leap, follow it with stepwise motion in the opposite direction. And we may use a single pair of tied notes in the counterpoint as long as both notes in the cantus firmus are consonant against the held note. We're also going to avoid leaps of an augmented second, diminished fifth, augmented fourth, and any sevenths. And we're not going to leap to our leading tone by any distance greater than a third. Now, as for the vertical dimension, we track the harmonic aspects of our counterpoint by identifying the generic intervals between voices written between the staves. So remember, in first species, only consonances are allowed, so that'll mean no seconds or no sevenths, and no augmented or diminished intervals ever. Perfect fourths, you think might sound great, but perfect fourths are considered dissonant in one-on-one counterpoint, so we're going to avoid those here. Perfect fifths and octaves, these are allowed, but we want to use them sparingly, basically at the start and end of the line, and whenever they appear, we need to approach them using contrary or oblique motion. As with our voice leading rules that we discussed in an earlier video, we're not using direct and parallel fifths ever, because those will be very obvious. The direct fifths, we can't hide an inner voice. There's only two voices. So to guide my efforts here, I'm first going to consider this top line and think of it kind of from a harmonic standpoint. What are the kinds of harmonic direction that the first line is giving, so I can imagine potential harmonies that my second line can work with. So if I look at this top line, I could maybe imagine if we're in the key, of C, this would be more of a modal composition if we're looking at this from a 16th century standpoint. But if we think about this from kind of harmonic expectations we'd have now, I would kind of see the first two bars being a tonic function. I see the La T, if we're in the key of C, that A is a La, that B is a T, as being like maybe a subdominant dominant. And then we come back to another 2 bars of tonic when it goes to Do to Mi. Both of those Res I see as being maybe 2 dominants, or maybe a subdominant to dominant, and then tonic by the end. So I'm thinking about these functions as I compose my second line. Going back to the idea of what intervals am I using, we want to begin with a perfect interval to start and conclude this composition. So I'll start with an octave, because that's a good place to start. And then as we go, I'm going to be thinking about what are the possible other tones of these harmonies that I've kind of implied below, and try and work as much contrary motion as I can against this line. Because the more I'm moving in the opposite direction of that top line, it'll sound like it's got a distinct melody of its own. So if I leapt from a C up to an E, that would keep us as a tonic harmony for that second bar. If I moved up to an F, that F against an A is kind of like a 4 chord, that works. And I'm thinking about this next chord as being like a dominant, so we could of course move that F to a G, but that makes 3 thirds in a row. So that's kind of lame, I'm kind of overusing the thirds. So let's go ahead and instead move it down to like a Re T. This still is dominant functioning, and it gives us contrary motion and the range of a sixth. And we could come over here to an octave, but again, we kind of want to save perfect octaves and perfect fifths for the end of the composition. So let's change this a little bit. Even though we thought it would be tonic E in the middle, let's make this more of a tonic substitute. So I'll leap instead up to an A. So that's A and C, it's kind of like a 6 chord. And then whenever we leap, we come down to the opposite direction. So let's move that to a 6th. That still gives us our kind of tonic E function. And instead of that being like dominant, dominant, tonic at the end with a Re, Re, Do, let's make this moving more like Fa, So, Do. So subdominant to tonic still works from a harmonic standpoint, gives us lots of range of contour and a range of different types of intervals between, and makes a satisfying kind of resolution towards the end. And notice that even though we have similar motion to that perfect interval at the very end, we did it by step in the soprano, so that's legit. So we hit all the benchmarks. We have a nice melodic contour, we leapt in this opposite direction, we have a range of different intervals between, we saved our perfect intervals for the beginning and the end. This should hit all of the criteria that we're trying to create to make a good contrapuntal line. Let's give it a listen. How about you try a stab at creating a contrapuntal line to the bottom one? This time the cantus firmus is in the bass. It sounds like this. Try creating a melody based on the rules we have on the right and based on what we just discussed on the first example. Pause the video, and when you've got a melody, try playing back and seeing, comparing what I come up with afterwards, and we'll compare. So let's get a shape of harmonically. What are we looking at here function-wise? I see kind of tonic, subdominant to tonic motion here. Maybe we leap back up to subdominant. And I won't say dominant here because we're going clearly back to a subdominant function. So I'm going to call it G tonic. And then Mi, Re, Do, tonic, dominant, tonic is where I see this melody serving a certain function. This whole thing is kind of like a tonic prolongation before the dominant at the end. So it's kind of like a tonic, dominant, tonic function. This time let's start it with a perfect fifth instead of a perfect octave and see where this gets us. I'm going to move up to like a 4 chord. This is going to be from a fifth to a third using similar motion. And then we're going to come down parallel thirds to a G to an E, like a tonic chord. Instead of going back up to A, we're not going to do that because that is going to be a direct octave. So instead, let's turn it where we go downwards to a sixth. And then perhaps I'll continue downward, parallel sixths here. That's all good. So some Mi to La. Let's jump up to La here, like a 4 chord. And then I think we can go down to G to be like a tonic triad here. Parallel third. And how about we leap up to our leading tone? Since we only leapt by a third, that's okay. It becomes a sixth, expanding to the octave, like a 5-1. That's parallel. This is contrary. This is contrary. Here's how this sounds. So our summary of note against note counterpoint means that there's a 1-to-1 ratio between your counterpoint rhythms and that of the cantus firmus. All of these notes are going to be consonant. So these need to be perfect or imperfect consonances. No dissonances are allowed anywhere. We're trying to avoid parallel perfect intervals. We're trying to use contrary and oblique motion as much as possible to create a distinct contour for your contrapuntal line. We're avoiding large leaps. That means a leap of over a perfect fifth. Whenever we have a leap, we're going to have stepwise motion in the opposite direction. We're trying to start and end our counterpoint with perfect consonances, usually expanding to a perfect octave at the end, and we might have a perfect fifth or a perfect octave at the beginning. And we want to make sure we're not using more than a string of 3 at the maximum of the same vertical interval between voices. So if you got more than perfect 3 thirds, 3 sixths, anything of the kind, change up the direction so we can have a greater range of intervals between voices. So that sums it up. We'll get into second and third species in our next video. I look forward to seeing you there.